The enemy came to erase us, but they left with their fleet in flames. I watched Japanese dive bombers scream down like metal vultures, their engines shrieking as they dove toward the small airstrip on Midway Atoll. Behind me, the fuel dump erupted into a tower of orange fire that turned the dawn sky the color of blood. The blast knocked me against the sandbags of our anti-aircraft gun emplacement, but I kept my hands locked on the twin barrels of our .5 caliber machine gun. Through smoke and chaos, more enemy planes banked for another attack run. They had come to wipe us off the map, but they didn't know we Marines had decided to make them pay for every inch of coral. My name is Corporal Jack Morrison of the United States Marine Corps, and this is the story of how a handful of Marines and sailors held the line at Midway Island while the greatest naval battle in the Pacific exploded around us. It is June 4th, 1942. The Japanese Empire has sent its combined fleet to destroy us and capture the island standing between them and Hawaii. They outnumber us 10-1. Their carriers carry more planes than we have ever seen, but they made one mistake. They underestimated what happens when you corner a Marine with nothing left to lose. 3 days earlier, Midway felt like the loneliest place on Earth. Our small atoll sat in the middle of the Pacific, 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, two tiny islands connected by a narrow strip of coral sand. Sand Island held the main base, Eastern Island, the airstrip. Together they made up barely 6 square miles of American territory, surrounded by thousands of miles of Japanese-controlled ocean. I had been on Midway for 8 months, ever since the attack on Pearl Harbor turned us from peacetime kids into warriors. Before December 7th, I was just another boy from Nebraska who joined the Marines to see the world. After Pearl Harbor, we knew we were fighting for our lives and our country's future. The Japanese had swept across the Pacific, taking the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. Now they were coming for Midway, and if they took it, they'd have a perfect staging point to invade Hawaii. On June 1st, our commanding officer, Colonel Harold Shannon, gathered every Marine and sailor for a briefing. He was a stocky man with steel gray hair and the eyes of someone who had seen combat in the last war. He didn't waste time. Intelligence showed a massive Japanese fleet approaching. 4 aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and transports carrying invasion forces. They meant to capture Midway and use it as a base for operations against Hawaii. A murmur ran through the ranks. We knew the odds were bad, but hearing the numbers made it real. 4 carriers meant hundreds of enemy aircraft. We had around 60 planes, many of them outdated. The colonel told us we were outnumbered and outgunned, but we had 3 things the Japanese didn't expect. We knew they were coming. We were fighting on American soil, and we were United States Marines. The cheer that rose from the men didn't hide the fear on their faces. My gun crew was Private Tommy Chan from San Francisco and Sergeant Mike O'Malley from Boston. Tommy was 19, a Chinese-American kid who joined after Pearl Harbor to prove his loyalty. O'Malley was a career Marine who had served in Nicaragua and knew more about gunnery than anyone on the island. After the briefing, O'Malley asked what my family back in Nebraska would think if they could see me now. I thought about the wheat farm and the endless golden fields. That world felt impossibly far away. I told him they'd want to know I was doing my job. He nodded and said we were about to find out how good we were at it. The next 2 days blurred together in constant preparation. We fortified our gun positions, stockpiled ammunition, and drilled non-stop. Our twin .50 caliber machine gun overlooked the northern approach to Sand Island, with a clear field of fire toward the airstrip. Everyone on the island worked around the clock. The pilots had the hardest task. Many of their planes were obsolete. We had a few F-4F Wildcats, but also the old F-2A Buffaloes the pilots called flying coffins. Our dive bombers were mostly SBD Dauntlesses. Good planes, but too few. The torpedo bombers were ancient TBF Devastators that flew so slowly they were easy targets. But the air crews never complained. They knew the odds and were ready to fly anyway. On June 3rd, our PBY patrol plane spotted the Japanese fleet to the northwest. The enemy was still several hundred miles away, but closing fast. That night, none of us slept. We lay in our bunkers listening to our own aircraft coming and going, knowing the fight would begin at dawn. Tommy cleaned his rifle for the 10th time that day and asked me if I thought we'd make it. He was scared. So was I. So was everyone. But we were Marines, and fear was just another tool to control. I repeated what O'Malley once told me. Marines don't plan on dying. We plan on making the other guy die for his country while we go home to ours. Tommy smiled weakly. Before I could say more, the air raid siren began to howl. It was 0630 on June 4th, 1942. The Battle of Midway had begun. The first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared as a dark cloud on the horizon. Through my binoculars, I saw dozens of dive bombers and fighters in tight formation heading straight for us. Behind them came more. It looked like the entire Japanese Air Force was descending on our tiny island. O'Malley shouted over the siren to remember our training and keep firing no matter what. Our Wildcats and Buffaloes were already airborne, climbing to intercept. I watched Major Floyd Parks lead his Buffalo squadron directly into the enemy. The Japanese had at least 40 bombers and as many Zero fighters. Parks had maybe 20 outdated planes. It was David versus Goliath, except David's slingshot was falling apart. Bombs began striking Eastern Island where the airstrip was. Even from a mile away, the blast wave shook the ground. Black smoke rose as Japanese bombers pounded the runways, but our pilots kept fighting. I watched Parks's plane take hits from 2 Zeros, smoke pouring from his engine, yet he kept firing until his aircraft tore apart in midair. Tommy whispered that our pilots were being slaughtered. He was right. Their courage was unmatched, but their planes couldn't compete. One by one they fell, but they took enemy planes with them. Then the bombers turned toward Sand Island, toward us. O'Malley called out the approach and told Tommy to feed the ammunition belt. The first dive bomber dropped almost vertically toward us, looking like a prehistoric bird with its fixed landing gear. It was a Val flown by a skilled pilot. He held the dive until I could see his face through the canopy, then dropped his bomb and pulled out barely 50 feet above us. The explosion hit 30 yards away. My ears rang as O'Malley shouted for me to traverse left and lead the next target. I swung the twin. 50s, aimed ahead of the diving Val, and fired. Tracers climbed toward it and stitched across its wing and engine cowling. Smoke poured out, but the pilot kept diving. The Japanese pilots had a kind of fearless commitment that I couldn't help respecting even as they tried to kill us. He released his bomb and tried to pull out, but the engine seized and the plane cartwheeled into the lagoon. One down, but dozens more were coming. The air over Midway dissolved into chaos as Japanese bombers attacked from every direction and our anti-aircraft guns fought back. The noise was beyond anything I had ever known. Diving planes screamed overhead, bombs exploded with thunderous force, machine guns rattled non-stop, and the heavier anti-aircraft guns added their deep, violent thumps. Smoke and dust filled the air so thickly that I could barely see 50 yards in any direction. Tommy fed ammunition belts into the gun as fast as he could, his face streaked with sweat and coral dust. He yelled that more bombers were approaching from the east. I swung the gun and saw 3 more Vals beginning their attack runs. These pilots had learned from the first wave. Instead of diving straight at us, they came in from different angles to make tracking them harder. It was smart, but not smart enough. I chose the closest bomber and opened fire. The pilot saw the tracers and tried to slip his plane sideways to throw off my aim, but at that altitude and speed, he could only do so much. My rounds hit his engine, and the Val immediately began trailing black smoke. Instead of pulling out and attempting to return to his carrier, the pilot kept coming straight at us. A chill went through me as I realized he was trying to crash his plane into our gun position. It was my first encounter with a Japanese pilot willing to die for his emperor, and it terrified me. I yelled for everyone to prepare for a kamikaze attempt and kept firing. At the last moment, the pilot slumped forward in the cockpit, and the Val slammed into the beach 50 yards short of our position. The explosion sent sand and debris flying in every direction, but we were still alive, and the gun still worked. The third bomber in that group was not so easily stopped. Its bomb landed directly on one of our fuel storage areas, and the explosion lit up the entire island. A column of flame shot hundreds of feet into the air, and burning aviation fuel spread across the ground like a river of fire. Tommy shouted that half our fuel supply was gone. The Japanese attack on Sand Island lasted 20 minutes. That felt like 20 hours. When the last bomber finally turned away and headed back toward the fleet, our small island looked like a cratered wasteland. Buildings were destroyed or burning, smoke drifted over everything, and the ground was pockmarked with fresh bomb craters. But we were still standing, and our guns were still ready. I checked our position. The gun was intact, though half our ammunition was gone. Tommy had taken some shrapnel in his left arm, but was still able to work. O'Malley had a cut on his forehead that was bleeding into his eyes, but he was grinning like a madman. He asked how many we'd brought down. I tried to keep count through the chaos. At least 6, confirmed, maybe 8. Hard to tell through the smoke. O'Malley told me it wasn't bad for a farm boy from Nebraska, but reminded us this had just been the first wave. They would be back. Something had changed in us during that first attack. We knew now we could stand up to the Japanese air assault and give as good as we got. More importantly, we had bought precious time for our own aircraft to take off and strike back. As we reloaded ammunition and tended to our minor wounds, a message came over the radio that made the entire gun crew cheer. Our torpedo bombers and dive bombers had reached the Japanese carriers and were beginning their attacks. While we were fighting for survival on Midway, something extraordinary was unfolding 200 miles to the northwest. Our scout planes had pinpointed the Japanese carrier fleet, and every aircraft capable of flying was heading toward them. The Japanese had expected to surprise us, but Admiral Nimitz had been reading their coded messages for weeks. We knew they were coming. The radio crackled with frantic reports. Through the static, we could make out pilots calling hits on Japanese ships. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, flying an SBD Dauntless, reported 4 Japanese carriers below him: Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu, launching aircraft. Then the radio went silent. When his voice returned, it was high with excitement. He reported a direct hit on Kaga and flames spreading across her flight deck. Cheers erupted around the bunker. The planes that had bombed Pearl Harbor were finally being paid back. More reports followed. Akagi was burning. Soryu had taken multiple hits and was listing heavily. Within 10 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were ablaze. The strongest fleet in the Pacific was suddenly crippled, but we weren't finished. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was still launching aircraft, and those planes were now heading straight for us. Lookouts called a second wave approaching from the northwest, 15 miles out. This time, the formation was larger and tighter. Hiryu had thrown everything she had into the air. Unlike the first wave, this one contained far more fighters. The Japanese had realized how heavy our anti-aircraft fire was. O'Malley checked our ammunition and said we had maybe 10 minutes of continuous fire left. After that, we'd be down to rifles and grenades. I counted at least 50 planes in the formation. We would have to make every shot count. Tommy insisted he was fine, despite the wound in his arm. The second attack differed from the first in several ways. The Japanese pilots were more cautious, but more desperate. They knew their carriers were burning, and many of them likely had nowhere to land, even if they survived. They approached from multiple directions to split our fire and confuse the gunners. The first group came in low over the water. Kate torpedo bombers, the same type that had devastated Pearl Harbor. But this wasn't Pearl Harbor. We were ready. Our 3-inch anti-aircraft guns opened fire first, filling the air with clouds of black flak. The Japanese formation shattered as pilots tried to dodge the bursts. Several Kates went down quickly, their torpedoes exploding as they hit the water, but others pressed on. One Kate lined up on the fuel storage area that had already been hit. The pilot flew so low that the propeller nearly skimmed the surface. I swung the twin. 50s and opened fire at maximum range. The bomber was at the edge of what our guns could reach, but I had to take the shot. The pilot tried to dodge, but at such low altitude, one mistake was fatal. His wingtip touched the water, sending the aircraft cartwheeling across the lagoon before exploding harmlessly. O'Malley shouted his approval, but warned that the dive bombers were coming. High above us, Vals began diving from 12,000 feet, this time in groups instead of individually. They targeted the radio station, the command bunker, and our gun position. I fired at the lead bomber as soon as he entered range, but these pilots were skilled. The Val wove left and right as it fell, making it nearly impossible to land a steady burst. My tracers passed alternately behind and ahead of him as he twisted through the sky. At the last second, the Japanese pilot leveled out his dive to line up directly on our position, giving me the steady target I needed. I fired a sustained burst straight into the Val's engine, and the bomber immediately began trailing smoke and flames. But just like the pilots from the first attack, this one was determined to complete his mission, even if it cost him his life. The bomb exploded about 20 feet from our sandbagged emplacement. The blast lifted me off my feet and threw me against the back wall of our gun pit. For a moment, I couldn't see or hear anything. When my vision cleared, I saw that our gun had been knocked off its mount, and Tommy was lying motionless beside the ammunition boxes. I crawled over to him. There was blood on his face, but he was breathing. A piece of bomb fragment had grazed his skull and knocked him out, but it hadn't killed him. Ali was bleeding from several small wounds, but he was already trying to remount the weapon. The attack was still in full force, and we had work to do. Between the two of us, we managed to get the twin. 50s firing again just as another group of dive bombers began their runs. This time, they were targeting the airstrip on Eastern Island, trying to prevent any more American aircraft from taking off to strike their fleet. But it didn't matter anymore. While we were fighting that second wave, incredible news came over the radio. The Japanese carrier that had launched the attack had been found and bombed by our aircraft. All 4 enemy carriers were now burning and sinking. The greatest naval force Japan had ever assembled was being destroyed in a single day, and we Marines on Midway had played our part by holding the island and keeping our airstrip operational long enough for our planes to strike back. when the last Japanese bombers finally disappeared over the horizon, heading toward a fleet that might not even exist when they got there. I looked around at what remained of our tiny island. We had been bombed, strafed, and nearly overrun, but we were still standing. The American flag was still flying over Midway, and the third Japanese attack never came. By mid-afternoon on June 4th, it became clear that the enemy fleet was in full retreat. Radio reports from our aircraft described a scene of devastation unlike anything in naval history. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk or sinking, along with several cruisers and destroyers. Thousands of Japan's best pilots and aircrew were dead or adrift in life rafts. Admiral Yamamoto had gambled everything on a decisive victory at Midway. Instead, he lost the heart of his carrier fleet and crippled Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific. The war was far from over, but this was the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire. On the island, we began counting our losses and caring for our wounded. Tommy regained consciousness but had a severe concussion and needed to be evacuated to Pearl Harbor. Sergeant O'Malley had taken shrapnel in his leg but refused to be evacuated, insisting he wouldn't leave before the job was done. Our casualties were lighter than expected considering what we'd endured. Out of roughly 3,000 American personnel on Midway, about 300 were killed or wounded. In exchange, we had helped destroy the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. It was a trade any commander would accept, but it didn't make writing letters to the families of the dead any easier. The pilots suffered the worst losses. Less than half of the aircraft that had taken off from Midway returned. Major Floyd Parks and most of his fighter squadron were gone. The torpedo bomber crews were nearly wiped out, pushing their attacks despite flying obsolete planes against impossible odds. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle stopped by our gun position that evening. His B-25 had taken several hits during the attack on the Japanese fleet, but he had made it back. He was covered in coral dust and looked as exhausted as the rest of us. He asked O'Malley how our gun crew had done. O'Malley bragged about my confirmed kills and Tommy's determination under fire. Doolittle looked at me with eyes that had seen more combat than most men ever would and asked where I was from. When I told him Nebraska, he told me I could say that the boy from a wheat farm had helped save the Pacific that day. He said every Marine and sailor who held the island while our aircraft attacked the Japanese fleet had helped win the battle. After he left, I climbed up on the remains of our emplacement and looked out over the lagoon. Wreckage from both American and Japanese aircraft littered the water, and smoke still rose from fires on Eastern Island. The atoll looked like it had been hit by a hurricane, but we were still there. Tommy sat with his back against the sandbags, his head wrapped in bandages. He asked if I thought the Japanese would return. I thought long before answering. They still had ships, carriers, and armies, but something fundamental had changed. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, we had met them in a major battle and not just held our own. We had crushed them. The war wasn't over, but after that day, I believed we were going to win. Over the next few days, more details emerged. Japan had indeed lost all 4 of its heavy carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with most of their aircraft and veteran aircrews. The elite pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor and conquered the Dutch East Indies were now gone. Our own losses were serious but manageable. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown had played crucial roles, though Yorktown, already badly damaged, would later be sunk by a submarine. But we proved that American industry and fighting spirit could match the Japanese even when the odds seemed hopeless. It has been more than 80 years since Midway, and I am one of the few survivors left. People often ask what it felt like to be part of such a turning point in history. And the truth is that we didn't know at the time how important it was. We were just Marines doing our job, holding our position, and fighting for our lives. Looking back, I can see that June 4th, 1942 was the day the tide turned in the Pacific. Before Midway, Japan seemed unstoppable. After Midway, they were forced into a defensive war they could not win. Our victory wasn't just about numbers or equipment. We were outnumbered in most categories. It came from intelligence, preparation, and the willingness of ordinary Americans to fight through impossible odds. Our codebreakers had cracked Japanese communications. Our scout planes found the carriers. And when the moment came, every man from the admiral to the lowest-ranking Marine did his job. Tommy Chen survived his wounds and served in the Guadalcanal campaign, earning the Silver Star for gallantry. After the war, he used the GI Bill to become an engineer and later helped design bridges across San Francisco Bay. He never forgot that America had given his family a new life, and he spent his own life giving back to the country that made him both a citizen and a Marine. Sergeant O'Malley stayed in the Corps until 1960, retiring as a master gunnery sergeant after serving in both World War